My name is Camila Marquez. I'm 34 years old, and for 12 years I believed that if I kept the trucks moving and the books balanced, my father would eventually put my name on the door, until the night I found the paperwork that proved he never intended to. Marquez Freight and Logistics ran 41 trucks out of a yard on the east side of Fresno, California, and I ran the yard. Not officially. My father, Ruben Marquez, held the title of president, and had held it since he founded the company in 1994 with 2 trucks and a loan he'd spent 11 years paying off. But by the time I was 22, I was the one who built the dispatch schedules at 5 in the morning, the one who renegotiated the fuel contracts when diesel prices spiked in 2018, the one who sat across from the bank's loan officer in 2020 and talked them into a bridge line of credit that kept the company running through 6 weeks when half our client contracts froze. My father liked to say, in front of drivers and customers alike, that Marquez Freight ran on his name and my hands. He said it like a compliment. I took it as one for longer than I want to admit. I kept a desk in the back office, behind the dispatch floor, with a window that looked out over the yard so I could watch the trucks roll in at the end of a shift and count them without leaving my chair. I knew every driver's route, every client's payment habits, every mechanic's diagnosis before he finished the sentence. I knew, down to the dollar, what the company's insurance premiums were going to do to our margins in the coming renewal. I built a spreadsheet in 2019 that our accountants still used, unmodified, 5 years later, because it had never once been wrong. If you've ever worked for a family business and told yourself the hours didn't matter, the missed birthdays didn't matter, the years without a real title or a real raise didn't matter, because someday, on paper, in ink, it would all belong to you too. You already know exactly where this story is going, and I hope you're braced for it better than I was. I had a son, Mateo, 16 that year, and most nights I made it home in time to sit across from him at the kitchen table while he did his homework and I answered emails on my phone, one eye on his algebra and one eye on the freight manifests for the morning. He used to ask me, half joking, when the sign out front was going to say Marquez and daughter. I used to tell him someday. I believed it when I said it. My younger brother, Daniel, was 28 and had worked at the company, on and off, for maybe 3 of those years. Mostly in the summers between community college attempts, mostly in a role our father called business development, which as far as I could tell meant taking clients to lunch. Daniel was good at lunch. He had our father's laugh and our father's easy way of filling a room, and neither of those things had ever once balanced a fuel account or talked a driver out of quitting at 11 o'clock at night. My mother, Elena, kept the company's books technically clean and Daniel's reputation cleaner, and between the two of them, I had learned a long time ago not to expect either of them to notice what I actually did all day. I didn't need them to notice. I told myself I needed my father to notice, and for 12 years, in his own way, he did. He called me indispensable to my face and something else, apparently, on paper, behind my back, for longer than I want to know. That night, the night this really starts, I was closing out the third quarter numbers at my kitchen table, the same table where Mateo did his homework, when I found a filing I wasn't supposed to have access to, on a shared drive Daniel had forgotten to lock down after a client meeting. It was a restructuring document. It had my father's signature on it. It did not have my name anywhere in it at all. I didn't confront my father that night. I told myself I needed to understand what I was looking at before I said anything, and I told myself that partly because it was true and partly because some part of me was already looking for a reason it might be a mistake, a draft, a version he'd never actually filed. I closed my laptop, put Mateo to bed, and lay awake until 2 in the morning turning it over. The confrontation I actually remember. The first one, the one that told me something was already decided long before that shared drive slipped open, happened 11 days earlier at my parents' house at a dinner my mother had planned for weeks because it was Daniel's birthday. There were maybe 14 of us around 2 pushed-together tables in my parents' backyard. Aunts, cousins, my father's oldest friend Hector, who'd worked freight routes with him back when the company was 2 trucks and a dream. My father stood at the head of the table with a glass of wine he'd barely touched and talked, the way he always did at these things, about the company. About how far it had come. About legacy. 29 years, he said, raising the glass toward Daniel. And I finally feel like I've got someone I can hand it to who understands what it actually means to build something. Not just run the numbers on a screen, build it. Put your name on it. Daniel's been talking to me about expansion into the Central Valley routes, real growth, the kind of thing this company hasn't done since I started it. I sat there with my fork halfway to my mouth. Daniel had asked me, 6 weeks earlier, to pull the margin data on 3 potential Central Valley routes so he'd have something to bring to Dad. I'd spent a weekend on it. I'd handed him a 9-page analysis with real numbers, real risk modeling, a route I'd flagged as promising and 2 I'd flagged as too thin to survive a bad fuel quarter. I hadn't been in the room when he brought it to our father. Apparently I hadn't needed to be, because in the version being toasted at his own birthday dinner, the analysis had a different author. To Daniel, my father said, and the table lifted their glasses, and I lifted mine too because that's what you do, and I felt something in my chest go very still and very quiet, the way it does right before you understand you're about to say something you can't take back, and then don't say it. My Aunt Rosita, 3 seats down, leaned toward me with the particular gentleness people use when they think they're being kind. "You must be so relieved, Mija," she said. "All those years carrying so much of it, now you get to just be his sister again, instead of, the one who has to worry about everything." "I don't mind worrying about it," I said. "Well, someone should get to just enjoy their life," she said, patting my hand. "Daniel's going to take such good care of it. And you have Mateo. That's the real inheritance, isn't it? A good boy like that." For a second I felt humiliated in a way I hadn't let myself feel out loud in years, and then I folded my napkin into a smaller square and said nothing. It wasn't cruelty the way a stranger would recognize it. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody said my name in a sentence that sounded like an attack. It was worse than that, in the particular way family cruelty usually is. It was affectionate. It assumed I'd be grateful to be set down. It assumed that 12 years of 5 a.m. dispatch schedules and bridge loans and a spreadsheet that never once needed correcting amounted, in the end, to something I'd done for love, and love doesn't come with a deed. My father caught my eye once, across the table, while everyone else had moved on to cake. He didn't say anything either. He just gave me a small nod, the kind you give an employee who's done a job well and can now step back, and lifted his glass another half-inch toward Daniel, not toward me. I drove home that night with Mateo asleep in the passenger seat, and somewhere around the Herndon exit my throat went so tight I had to stop talking to myself out loud, which I'd been doing since we left the driveway, working through excuses for my father that I no longer entirely believed even as I made them. He's just proud of Daniel for once. He didn't mean it like that. He knows what I do. He has to know. I didn't cry. I've never been much of a crier, even as a kid, even at my own wedding, even at my divorce 3 years before this. I just drove and counted mile markers, and by the time I pulled into my own driveway, I had rebuilt the story enough times that I could carry it into the house and put my son to bed and go back to work in the morning like nothing at that table had been about me at all. It would be 11 more days before I found the filing that told me it hadn't been about me at all. It had been decided on paper long before that dinner, and the toast hadn't been an oversight. It had been an announcement I wasn't yet supposed to be able to read. I want to explain what 12 years actually looked like, because I worked for my father's company doesn't cover it, and I think you need the real shape of it to understand what that restructuring document actually took from me. I started full-time at Marquez Freight the summer I was 22, 3 months out of a business degree I'd paid for myself with loans I was still finishing off in my 30s. My father hired me at a wage that was, by his own admission at the time, family rate. $12 less an hour than the dispatch coordinator I replaced, with the understanding, spoken more than once, that I was building equity instead of taking salary. I believed that. I want to be honest that I believed it completely, the way you believe things your father tells you when you're 22 and he's never once, as far as you know, lied to you about anything that mattered. For the first 6 years I ran dispatch. I built the scheduling system from a whiteboard and a legal pad into a database that cut idle truck time by almost a third, which on 41 trucks and rising diesel prices was real money. I calculated it once for a bank presentation at just over $340,000 a year in recovered efficiency. Nobody paid me a bonus for that number. My father used it to get a better rate on our equipment financing and told me, genuinely proud, that I'd saved the company. I took the pride as payment because it was what was on offer. In 2018, when our biggest client threatened to pull their contract over a series of late deliveries that weren't our fault, a bridge closure that rerouted 3 of our regular hauls for 6 weeks, I was the one who flew to their regional office in Bakersfield, on a Saturday, on my own dime because the company card was maxed from a bad month, and sat across from their logistics director for 4 hours until I'd rebuilt a delivery schedule that satisfied their contract terms. I kept that client. That client's contract 7 years later was worth just under $1.1 million a year to the company. My father shook my hand when I got back and said, "That's my girl." He did not renegotiate my salary that year or the year after. In 2020, when half our contracts froze in the first months of the pandemic and the company's cash position went from comfortable to 11 weeks from insolvency, I was the one who sat in a loan officer's office and, without my father in the room because he said negotiations weren't his strength, talked a regional bank into a $650,000 bridge line of credit that kept every one of our 41 trucks on the road and every one of our drivers on payroll through the worst of it. I remember calling my father from the parking lot afterward, so relieved I could barely get the words out, and him saying, "See, this is why I need you here." I held on to that sentence for years. I need you here. I didn't hear until much later what it left out. The second incident I keep coming back to happened the following spring, in 2021, at a meeting with our insurance broker about renewing the company's liability coverage. A renewal that, if it lapsed even briefly, would have shut down every truck on the road by law. I'd spent 3 weeks building the risk documentation the broker needed. Safety records, driver certifications, maintenance logs going back 5 years, organized in a way that got our premium quote down by nearly $80,000 from the broker's opening number. My father sat in on the final call. When the broker complimented the documentation, said specifically, "Whoever put this together clearly knows what they're doing," my father said, "That's just how we run things here," and moved the conversation along without once saying my name, though I was sitting 3 feet from him at the same table. I didn't say anything that day either. I've thought about that a lot since. How many rooms I sat in where crediting me would have cost my father nothing, and he simply didn't spend it. Somewhere in that same stretch of years, my mother started introducing me at family gatherings as the one who helps out at the business, a phrase that got smaller every year even as what I actually did got larger. Daniel, meanwhile, got introduced as working with his father, present tense, ongoing, important sounding, for a role that in any given year might mean 4 months of actual hours logged. I built the fuel hedging strategy that saved the company an estimated $210,000 over 18 months during the 2022 price spikes. I renegotiated 3 vendor contracts in 2023 that added roughly $95,000 a year straight to margin. I trained 4 dispatch hires who are still with the company today, none of whom report to Daniel, all of whom report, on paper, to my father and functionally every single day to me. None of it had my name on anything that mattered. I know that now. I think some part of me knew it for years and built elaborate reasons not to look directly at it, because looking at it meant admitting that the man telling me I was indispensable had never once made that indispensability legally real. I think about the language most of all, looking back. My father was never a man who ran out of warm words. He had a whole vocabulary for what I was to the company. Indispensable, the backbone, my right hand, the one who actually keeps this place standing, and every single phrase in that vocabulary was something you'd say about a load-bearing wall, not about an owner. You complement a wall. You don't cut it a share of the building. That's the pattern the restructuring document confirmed rather than created. It didn't surprise me because it was new. It surprised me because I'd spent 12 years choosing, again and again, to believe the sentence instead of the paperwork, and because some part of me, even that night at my kitchen table with the filing open in front of me, was still hunting for a version of events where I hadn't been quite that foolish for quite that long. I spent the next 4 days doing the only thing I knew how to do when I didn't understand a situation. I built a spreadsheet. I pulled every document I had legitimate access to, payroll records, vendor contracts, the equipment financing agreements I'd personally negotiated, and cross-referenced them against the restructuring filing I'd found on the shared drive. What I found wasn't a rumor or a hurt feeling I could talk myself out of. It was a new holding entity filed 8 months earlier called Marquez Family Holdings II LLC. My father was listed as managing member. Daniel was listed as sole additional member, with a 40% ownership stake, effective immediately. I was not listed anywhere in the entity at all. The filing routed the company's real estate. The yard, the maintenance building, 2 parcels my father had bought in 2016 specifically because I'd flagged them as undervalued, out of the original operating company and into the new holding entity, at a valuation I recognized instantly as low, because I was the one who'd priced comparable parcels for the company's insurance appraisal 2 years earlier. The real number was closer to $2.4 million. The filing valued it at $1.1 million. I sat with that for a long time. Then I called our family's accountant, Priya, who had done our books for 9 years and who I trusted the way you trust someone who has never once had a reason to lie to you. I didn't tell her what I'd found. I asked her, carefully, in the most neutral voice I could manage, whether she'd been asked to prepare any documentation for a new holding entity in the last year. There was a pause on the line long enough that I knew the answer before she gave it. "Camila," she said, "I assumed you knew. I assumed that's why you weren't on the transfer paperwork, because you two had already worked out something separate, something better, since you're the one who actually—" She stopped herself. "I should have called you directly. I'm sorry. I thought I was staying out of a family conversation that had already happened. It hadn't happened. Nobody had had that conversation with me. The conversation had happened around me, over 8 months, in filings and phone calls I wasn't copied on, while I kept building spreadsheets and flying to Bakersfield and calling loan officers on behalf of a company that had, on paper, already decided I wasn't going to own any part of it. I asked Mateo, later that week, sitting at the same kitchen table where I'd first found the filing, whether he thought I should talk to a lawyer before I said anything to my father at all. He was 16, and he looked at me for a long moment with an expression I recognized because it was mine, the same flat, calculating look I gave a route schedule that wasn't adding up. "Mom," he said, "you've been running that whole company for as long as I can remember, and Grandpa's never once put your name on anything. I think you already know what you should do." He paused. "You should get a lawyer. Today. Not next week." I capped my pen and set it down. I made the call the next morning, to an attorney named Rosalind Ferris who specialized in closely held family business disputes and who I'd found, 3 years earlier, doing due diligence on a completely unrelated equipment lease. I laid out what I had, the shared drive filing, my own cross-reference spreadsheet, the appraisal discrepancy, 12 years of contribution I could document to the dollar because I was, apparently, constitutionally incapable of doing anything without documenting it. Rosalind was quiet through most of it, taking notes, and when I finished she said something I've held on to since. "You didn't stumble into a strong case," she said. "You built one. For 12 years, without knowing that's what you were doing." She asked me to bring in everything. Every contract I'd negotiated in my own name or with my own authorized signature, every performance record, every year of tax filings, every piece of correspondence where my father had, in writing, credited me with keeping the company alive. She said the appraisal gap alone, on a $2.4 million asset moved for $1.1 million 8 months before what looked like a deliberate succession announcement, was the kind of discrepancy a court took seriously. She said we had time to do this carefully, methodically, the way I'd apparently done everything else for 12 years, and that carefully was going to matter more than fast. I asked her what came first. "First," she said, "we need every document your father doesn't know you have. And then we need to find a moment when he doesn't expect you're holding any of them at all." I thought about the dinner. I thought about the toast. I thought about my father's small, satisfied nod across the table, aimed at Daniel, and the vocabulary he'd used on me for 12 years. Indispensable, my right hand, the backbone of this whole operation. Every word of it, I now understood, chosen because it cost him nothing and committed him to nothing at all. There was a company-wide meeting scheduled in 5 weeks, the annual all-staff gathering where my father traditionally announced the coming year's plans in front of every driver, every mechanic, every office employee, and most of our major clients. It was, Rosalind pointed out when I mentioned it, exactly the kind of moment she meant. "That's a room full of witnesses," she said. "And it's a room where he'll be doing all the talking, right up until he isn't." The annual meeting was held, the way it had been every year I could remember, in the break room turned briefly into a banquet hall. Folding tables pushed against the walls, a sheet cake from the bakery on Blackstone that my mother always ordered, 40-some employees and a dozen of our biggest clients standing shoulder to shoulder between the vending machines and the dispatch board. My father stood at the front with a microphone he didn't need in a room that size, because he liked having one. Rosalind had walked me through exactly what I could and couldn't do in a room full of people who weren't parties to a dispute. No accusations dressed as facts, nothing that could read as defamation, nothing that assumed a conclusion the paperwork hadn't yet reached in front of a judge. "You're not there to win the room," she'd told me the night before. You're there to put true, provable things on the record in front of witnesses and let the documents do what documents do. I had a folder. I'd built it myself the way I built everything. Tabbed, chronological, 3 copies, one for my father, one for the company's outside counsel who happened to be in the room that night for an unrelated matter, and one for me. My father worked through the usual opening. Thanked the drivers, thanked the mechanics, made a joke about diesel prices that got the laugh it always got, and then he moved into the part of the speech I'd known was coming since the birthday dinner 5 weeks earlier. This year, he said, I want to start talking publicly about the next chapter for Marquez Freight. 29 years ago, I started this with 2 trucks. I'm proud to say the next generation is already stepping up to carry it forward. My son Daniel has been taking on more and more of the vision for where this company goes next, and I couldn't be prouder too. Dad, I said. Before you go further, can I say something? It'll take 3 minutes. The room went quiet in the specific way a room goes quiet when the tone doesn't match the moment. My father's smile held, but his eyes didn't. Camila, this isn't really there. 3 minutes, I said. You've had the floor for 29 years. I'd like 3. He gestured tightly for me to go ahead, because 40 employees and a dozen clients were watching, and refusing would have cost him more than granting it. I reached into my folder, drew out the top set of pages, and set them flat on the table beside the cake. Facing him, my hand steadier than I expected it to be after 5 weeks of rehearsing this exact motion in an empty kitchen. 8 months ago, I said, this company filed paperwork creating a new holding entity called Marquez Family Holdings II. That entity now owns the yard we're standing next to, the maintenance building, and both parcels on Belmont. My father is the managing member. My brother holds a 40% stake, effective immediately. I turned the second page toward him. The land was transferred into that entity at a valuation of $1.1 million. I priced these same parcels for our insurance appraisal 2 years ago, using documentation I still have, at $2.4 million. I'm not here to guess why there's $1,300,000 gap between what this company's real estate is worth and what it was recorded as worth 8 months ago. I'm here to say the gap exists, it's documented, and it's now a matter for our attorneys and, if it comes to it, for a court. This is not the place, my father started, and his voice had gone up half a register, the first crack in 29 years of easy public warmth. You're right that it's not the ideal place, I said. I'd have preferred a conversation. I asked for one, the week after I found the filing, twice, and you told me both times you were too busy. I kept my voice level. I'd practiced that part more than any other part. I'm not raising this to embarrass you in front of people who respect you. I'm raising it here because it's the first room in 8 months where I could be certain you'd actually respond instead of putting it off again. You went digging through company files you had no business in. I have full authorized access to every document I referenced tonight, I said. I can show anyone in this room right now exactly where each figure comes from. I set the third page down, the appraisal report itself, with my own signature on the cover letter. This isn't an accusation, Dad. It's arithmetic. I built the spreadsheet that got us the equipment financing in 2019. I flew to Bakersfield on my own dime to save the Ferris transport contract in 2018. I got us the bridge loan in 2020 that kept every truck in this yard on the road and every person in this room on payroll. None of that is in dispute, and none of it appears anywhere in the ownership of Marquez Family Holdings II. My father's jaw worked, and for a moment I thought he might raise his voice all the way, in front of everyone, and some old reflex in me braced for it the way I'd braced for it my whole life. Behind him, I saw my mother's hand go still on the cake knife, and Daniel, off to the side near the vending machines, had gone the particular pale of someone doing math he didn't want to be doing in front of a room full of clients. Nobody moved to help him. Not Whitfield, not yet, not for a long few seconds. The whole room just held there, 40 employees and a dozen clients pretending to study the folding tables while they listened to every word. Then his outside counsel, a man named Whitfield I recognized from a contract negotiation 2 years back, leaned toward him and said something low that I couldn't hear, and my father's shoulders dropped half an inch. "We'll discuss this privately," my father said to me, quiet now, the microphone still loosely in his other hand, forgotten. "I'd welcome that," I said. I've been asking to for 5 weeks. I squared the 3 pages in front of me, gathered my copies, and stepped back from the table without another word, and the room stayed silent for 3 full seconds before someone, I never found out who, started awkwardly to clap and then stopped, unsure if that was the right thing to do at all. We talked 3 days later, not that night. My father called Rosalind's office directly, which she said was itself a kind of concession, and the 4 of us met in a conference room at her firm downtown. Me, my father, Rosalind, and his attorney Whitfield. My mother wasn't there. Daniel wasn't there. My father asked at the start whether we could keep this between family, and Rosalind told him, not unkindly, that the appraisal discrepancy alone meant it had already stopped being a family matter the day the filing was recorded. I didn't raise my voice in that room. I didn't need to. I'd written out, the night before, every line I wanted to say, and by the time I was sitting across the table from him I didn't need the notes anymore, because I'd been carrying the actual list for 12 years. You told me, the day I got back from Bakersfield in 2018, "That's my girl," I said. I held on to that for years. What I was actually doing that year was flying out on a Saturday, on my own card, to save a client contract worth over $1 million a year, and you didn't renegotiate my pay that year or the year after. My father started to say something. I kept going evenly. You told me after the bridge loan in 2020, "This is why I need you here." I held on to that one even longer. What I was actually doing that year was keeping 41 trucks on the road and every driver in this company on payroll through 11 weeks that could have ended the business. Alone in a bank office because you said negotiations weren't your strength. Camila. You told our insurance broker in 2021, sitting 3 feet from me, "That's just how we run things here," after he complimented documentation I'd spent 3 weeks building. What I was actually doing that day was sitting silently next to you, the way I sat silently for a lot of years, because saying my own name out loud in that room felt like it would have cost you something you weren't willing to spend. The room was quiet. Rosalind didn't say anything. Whitfield had stopped writing. "And 8 months ago," I said, "you filed paperwork moving $2.4 million of this company's real estate into an entity with your name and Daniel's name on it, and mine on nothing, at a valuation you knew, because I'm the one who built the number you used to dispute it, was wrong. I don't think you did that because you don't love me. I think you did it because for 29 years, telling me I was indispensable cost you nothing, and putting my name on a deed would have cost you something, and somewhere along the way that became the whole rule you were operating by, without you ever having to say it out loud to yourself." My father was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice didn't have the register it had had at the meeting. It was smaller, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, it sounded like it was actually mine to hear, not a version built for a room. "I always meant to fix it," he said. "I kept telling myself there'd be a better year to do the paperwork right. And then Daniel started asking, and it was easier to say yes to something specific than to finally do the thing I'd been putting off with you." "I know," I said. "That's what I've been trying to tell you for 5 weeks. It was always easier to put it off with me. That's not a plan. That was never a plan. That was just 12 years of me being the person you didn't have to keep a promise to, because I never once made you." I stood up, gathered my folder, and didn't slam the conference room door on my way out. I closed it the way I closed everything, carefully, with both hands, the same way I'd have closed a filing cabinet at the end of a long shift. The settlement, when it finally came 6 weeks later through Rosalind's office, restructured the company's ownership entirely. The real estate reverted to the original operating entity at its correct appraised value, and I was named as a 25% equity holder in Marquez Freight and Logistics, retroactive, with a formal title, Vice President of Operations, attached to a salary that finally matched what I'd been doing unpaid for 12 years. Daniel kept his stake in the holding entity, smaller than it had been, and took over business development in name and in fact, which turned out, once someone actually gave him the job description in writing, to suit him better than the vague authority he'd been handed at that birthday dinner. My mother didn't apologize, not directly, but she stopped introducing me as the one who helps out, and started, slowly, calling me by my actual title instead. Mateo asked me, the week the settlement finalized, whether the sign out front was finally going to say Marquez and daughter. "Something better," I told him. "It's going to say my name on the paperwork that actually matters, which is the only kind of sign that was ever real." I still keep a desk behind the dispatch floor, with the same window looking out over the same yard, and I still count trucks rolling in at the end of a shift without meaning to, because 12 years of a habit doesn't undo itself just because your name is finally on the paperwork it was always attached to in every way except the one that counted. What I keep coming back to, almost a year later, isn't the meeting or the settlement or even the conference room where I finally said all 12 years out loud in order. It's how long I mistook being called indispensable for being made secure, and how those turned out to be two completely different things that happen to sound almost identical when the person saying them loves you. Love was never the part that was missing. What was missing was the follow-through, the deed, the title, the 25% that should have existed years before I had to build a case file to go get it. I don't think my father set out on some specific morning to leave me out of everything. I think it happened the way most of these things happen. One deferred conversation at a time, one easier yes to somebody else instead of one harder yes to me, until 8 months of paperwork had quietly become the truth of where I stood, whether or not anyone had ever meant for it to add up that way. That's the part I'd want anyone hearing this to sit with if they recognize themselves in any of it. The absence of a deliberate betrayal doesn't make the outcome any less real or any less yours to finally go correct. I don't regret 12 years of 5 a.m. dispatch schedules or a Saturday flight to Bakersfield on my own dime. I regret how long it took me to understand that being needed and being valued aren't the same promise, and that only one of them comes with your name actually written down anywhere that matters. If you've ever built something real inside a family business and told yourself the title would come eventually, I'd ask you the same question I finally asked myself. What's actually written down with your name on it right now, today? Not what you've been told, but what you could put your finger on if someone needed proof. If this one felt true to you or true to somebody you know, share it with them. Sometimes the person who needs to hear it is the one still telling themselves someday is a plan. This story is a work of fiction, inspired by patterns common to real family businesses, and any resemblance to actual people or events is coincidental.